So with React so far, we've seen a lot of a lot of stuff built into the React library, a lot of different functionality we can use. A lot of it related to the data we are using. Once you get past separating your app into multiple components and maybe routing, most of the hard part of your React app is actually storing data in various ways, either in memory or semi-persistently in the browser, or you know figuring out where to store data, updating it, passing it between components, things like that. Getting from basically a bunch of static components to how we can hold meaningful data and also maybe change how our app renders because of it. Which obviously the point of most apps is at least somewhat tied to their data almost entirely. People are obviously there for a reason, so it would make sense that the data is one of the driving things behind what we're doing. At this point, though, it is worth pausing for a second and looking at how we can incorporate data into our app, because right now all we have the ability to do is stuff local to React or using external um, data from some external location. Most apps, obviously, there's a client side, but there's almost always some server side, right? There's some real reason the app exists. There's some server side that holds data persistently, right? Makes sure that we have some sort of persistent data, persistent interaction. There's a little more business logic back there that isn't part of the React app. Pretty much every app is like this. We have pretty much every app uses a database, right, to store user information or a lot of other information between logins or between sessions. We haven't seen this. We've been able to use GET requests to take data from some external locations, but we haven't ever really used anything else. We haven't really used or sent data to any other locations. We can't really interact dynamically with a database. So today we're going to start taking some time to integrate our own client-side application with some server-side code, all right, that we create, as opposed to something that is just like external and not ours or under our control, but also obviously that doesn't store our data persistently. So to start off, we're going to make a really simple one component app today. We're not going to create any other component files. We're just going to work out of this app.js. But we're also going to write some Python code. So we're going to create sort of both a really basic client and server side of our application today, just so we can see a little bit of what that looks like. Again, and start sort of putting the whole thing together, at least at a really cursory level. So today we're gonna create basically a login application. All we're gonna do is submit login data, and we're gonna get back some answer that says whether we logged in successfully. If we can do that, right, it means we can pass some data to a backend and correctly get back the right response, and then React can use that response and handle it and to do something based on it, right? Render something based on it, and that's the whole flow we really need. We can always use, multiple data submission actions or data acquisition actions, and just grow our components as we would like to interact with different types of data. So we're going to start with the React side of things mostly. We're going to put together most of our app. And then we're going to move to the Python side of things, again, just so we can look at them a little in isolation, make things a little easier. To start out with, in this app.js, I've already imported React. I've already imported the stateful hook, which we're going to need, obviously, to acquire our data. And right now my app is currently running in my browser. It just looks like this. All right, we don't really have CSS or anything yet. We're not really going to need much of it today, but we're going to put together a really basic UI. All right, so we're going to put together a login form, which is going to include only about 4 different elements. We're going to have a heading element that will just say the greatest login app ever, just something that will show us some text, right? So we got a nice text up there. And then we're going to capture 2 different inputs. And I'm going to actually give these different types now. So we'll have type equals, text. And then we'll have another input of type equals password, again, just so that it shows up with the little bubbles as a slightly more passwordy experience. And then finally, a button that will just say log in. All right. And so, there we go. Input, our button, right? Again, the different input types really just sort of cosmetically change what we see from a user perspective, right? Do I see password or do I see little bubbles? And then the button will actually log us in once we click it. Again, we could use CSS, right? Make this look a little nicer. We're really concerned about functionality for now, so we're going to keep this just horizontal for the time being. Again, we could always add line breaks or something later just to make our app look a little bit nicer. So now that I have my elements, obviously we're going to need to keep track of a few things, right? Again, we're going to keep doing what we've been doing. We're going to use some controlled input elements so that rather than referencing each of them dynamically when I want to log in to get their values, we'll just keep state updated all the time with our values. All right, so I'm going to have input username and set input username in state. Again, hopefully this is starting to look a little bit formulaic, right? How we can create state really quickly, right? Get a variable name function that will update it, and then use these to store and dynamically update values in our app. And then in addition to this, we'll get input's what I wanted to keep. Input password and set input password. And again, just we'll have again an immediate JavaScript reference for both of these values, as opposed to a scenario where we wouldn't, right? Where instead we might have, again, to use document related functionality from outside React or something. It's just much easier to do it this way again with JavaScript. For these to work, obviously I need each of these inputs to also have an onChange event listener for now. So each of these is going to need a function, right, that will ultimately, again, take one of these, right, and I'm going to, again, do this both ways. We can, if we need to, right, for something this short, we could always make an arrow function that will simply take in the event itself, call set input password with the event's targets value with an A, which is okay for really short functions, but obviously even something this short will clutter up what our sort of JSX or HTML type readout looks like. So we may instead want to create a handler function, right? The other way we can go about this, which would be function username change handler, which is honestly mostly name and probably less logic than the name. Whoops, we'll call set input username. And again, they both accomplish the same task. The only difference is where the function lives, how modular it is, if you can reuse it and put it somewhere else. Right? So, then I can attach this function to our button. And again, we can see both ways of doing this. So now that I have this, we're also going to need a function. Because right now, no matter how much I track these inputs, we still have no action, right? The button is not doing anything for us. So we need to give a function to the button, all right? If we think through it, this function is going to need to do a few things. So I'm going to create a function, send off info. I'll just call it this for now. Whoops. Which is going to be an async function. And I'll write it like an arrow function again, just to get practice seeing these defined. So if I think through this, we're going to have a few steps, right? One, we need to create our post request, right? We're not using a get request. This is, semi secure user information, right? There's a password being involved. We want to keep exposure to a minimum, obviously. So we'll create our post request. Once we've created our post request and its additional data, right, which is also going to include our JSON data, right? What does that look like? And then we're also going to need to, send, or not really send, but call fetch. As we've seen before, once we've called fetch, we're going to need to receive our response. I'll actually add this up to fetch because it'll probably be returned, same line. And then once we have a response, parse response for JSON. Right, we want to get some sort of JSON out of our response. There should hopefully be data coming back to us. And then once we have that, we want to save something in state. Right, our component isn't going to change or update based on some value changing unless we use state. So we need to update something in state, which should trigger a refresh or a re-render somewhere on our page. We'll worry about storing that and figuring out what it is once we can send the request. Right, if we can see it in our console, that'll be our first step. Then we can save it dynamically and use it semi-dynamically. But let's start here for now, just so that we can get this portion of our code down. We already know how to do this, right? So let's start here with what we do know. So we can say, const response equals await fetch. And then I'll just make up an endpoint for now. We don't have one yet, so I'm kind of free to figure out whatever I want to call it, and then we can make sure it lines up after the fact when we start creating some server-side code. So we're going to use http://localhost port 5000, which is again Flask's default port, /login, and I'm just going to call it login for now. After we've sent this request, again, we've seen this before, right? We have an HTTP response. We can just create a new variable name and then await this JSON parsing method of our response. We should now, hopefully, after this is concluded, have an object, right? We're going to call it user data for now, but this should be an object. And I'll just console.log it for now. All right. So we basically have this, parse our data, and then save and state we will again do later. I'll just leave this as a comment with no code under it for now. The thing we haven't done yet, obviously, with fetch is send a post request. And so the way fetch works, if you just call fetch with an endpoint, it will send a get request, right? So this right here is technically sending a get request to localhost port 5000/login. To customize fetch, we give it an object with a bunch of keys and values, with each of these keys or properties being basically the different things we want to change, the different parameters we want to change in our request. So I'll just create that object right here, const, I'll call it configs for now for your configuration stuff. And we just pass that then as our second argument to fetch. Configs, we can customize the type of request, the data we send, we can add headers to our request. There's a lot of customization we can add. We're gonna, for now, just do those three though. So in this object, the things you want to change, right, is we don't want to send a get request, so we want to change the method. So we can use the method property to update the type of method we are using with fetch. So we're going to send now a post request, right? Method, the value is what we're changing this to. And then we can use the body key here to add data, all right? So the body property we're going to set to, I'll first create an object, and we want to basically create an object with a key username and a value for input username. And then I'll indent both of these actually. And then, whoops, password and input password. All right, so we're essentially just taking the data out of state, throwing it in here. Obviously, this is a JavaScript object, so this isn't exactly what we're looking for right now. Technically, this is a JavaScript type. It has associated methods and other data that doesn't really work in text format. It's the same reason that in Python we can't just send a dictionary easily, right? We get Python's error, right? This object is not JSON serializable. Same idea here. We're actually going to need to call the stringify method of the JavaScript JSON module. And it will basically take whatever we give and serialize it, right? Create the text representation of this object so we can send it adequately as data, right, of the JSON type. Ultimately, it's basically just, again, taking the characters of our object and converting them into text, again, instead of an object that has additional properties, methods, right, different things we can reference built into JavaScript that are not transferable outside of Python. So, finally, we're also going to send one type of header for now. And here the headers are pretty easy. This is just an object of properties, which are the header name, and the values are just the the value we are setting to that header, right? So the one we're going to use is content type, and this again must be cased perfectly, spelled correctly. Content type, and then we're going to set this to what we've seen before already, application/JSON. Again, just to let our server know, right, that there is JSON data coming in as opposed to some other type of data. It's not JSON, right? Because that's good to obviously know. I'm going to indent these curly braces so they're wrapped up with each other. Actually, that's a lie. I'll leave them on their own lines just so it's easier to see the nesting. And so now we have this object of our body, the data, and the headers we're sending. We pass it here. We should now send a post request with this data and at least this header. Cool. So this method, then once I have it, I can just tie it to our button, right? Using the click event listener, and it will, in fact, every time we click, hopefully this function will fire. All right, so obviously this doesn't exist yet. So what I'm gonna hope for right now is simply that I can type two things into my inputs. I will quickly console.log or configs object so that if I click the button, I should see an object that has the method and headers, and more importantly, has my data as part of a string, but it should have the right username and password. And then I should see some type of 400 status code that tells me this location doesn't exist. All right. I'll consider that success, obviously, until we have some backend sort of code that is running. All right. So if I go over here to our incredibly simple app, if I open up my console, renavigate to my console, there we go. I can type in a username, so I'll just say Greg, and I'll type in a password. I'll use the string password, and then click login. I get, right, this object, so we have method post. Our body is, again, this string representation of our object, which has the correct username and password, most importantly, and has the header I want, right, application/JSON with the content type property. I also get, right, whoops, this uncaught failed to fetch issue. We get error connection refused from fetch, which is good, right? This location doesn't exist, so I'm actually fine with this. All right. So now we've set up a post request, which is honestly pretty similar to what we've done before with fetch. The only difference is we need to just create an object where we specify a few more little things, to tell fetch explicitly what to do and what data to send and where to send it, and how to send it. So at this point, it's time to sort of pivot from the React code to the backend side of things. All right, so we'll take a quick break here, and then we'll pick up with Flask in just a second.